Hi, everybody, and welcome to the HCD Research webinar series. Today, we are going over the topic, Making Claims That Stick, a frank discussion on the science of claims testing in consumer and wellness products. Today, we'll be joined by a few people I'll introduce later who are experts in this field. I myself am Michelle Nigella, and I'll be hosting the discussion today. As we start, I just wanted to launch into some background information here for today's webinar, Making Claims That Stick. I'm going to do a little bit of introduction first before we launch into the panel discussion, and also a little bit of housekeeping. You do have a Q&A button that you should be able to access if you want to ask any questions directly to us. We'll also be sharing a couple of links shortly if you wanted to find out more about some of the information that we'll be discussing. Today, we're going to be talking about wellness and claims testing. So what are wellness products and what exactly goes into making any sort of research claim or product claim? We'll be having a panel discussion where I'll first be introducing our panelists, and then we will be opening it up to an open discussion to frankly talk about all these sort of issues that kind of go into both wellness products and claims testing. And we'd love to receive any of your questions as well. So please feel free to ask any questions or make any comments during this presentation or during the discussion, and we'll do our best to address all of your questions. So be sure to participate and interact with us and chat, and you can use, again, that chat function or the Q&A. A little bit of background on who we are. Again, my name is Michelle Murphy-Nigella, VP of Research and Innovation at HCD. HCD Research has been around for almost 30 years, really working on market and consumer research about understanding the holistic consumer experience, perceiving, evaluating, responding to stimuli. Our work can be done globally, so in person or online. We use all sorts of applied consumer neuroscience tools as well as traditional market research tools. And we look at the entire consumer experience from early stages of product exploration all the way through validation in consumer products and product development, all the way through marketing and communication. So when we're talking about wellness, wellness is the active process that people take of becoming aware of and making choices towards having a healthy and fulfilling life or lifestyle. And the wellness-focused consumer is consciously taking control of their well-being to create an optimal way to live that is best for their needs. And so when they're looking at products in this space, they're looking for something that is going to help them reach these goals. And a lot of times these sort of products, the wellness products that exist out there for one person might be an aid to recovery, maybe from an illness, while another might look at it more as a way to enhance some sort of aspect of their health. So perhaps it's using something to clear up their skin, maybe it's an Apple Watch, right, that's helping them look at their health in a different way or start to monitor themselves. Maybe it's having added benefits to their typical products that they use. Maybe it's taking supplements or using natural ingredients that are supposed to have some sort of additional effect. But all of these things every day, new and improved consumer products land on the store shelves, and people are looking to make an edge with them. Marketers often find it by highlighting a unique ingredient or desirable benefit. The validity of marketing claims that are backed by clinical research and substantiation is really the cornerstone of establishing consumer confidence and brand loyalty. If the claims are not in sync with the consumer's perceived benefits from taking the product, repeat purchases often become a problem. The average person has a shorter attention span than a goldfish, right? So though to be fair, most goldfish don't have iPhones, so perhaps goldfish actually have a better attention span. For marketers, that means that you have around 3 seconds to convince a consumer that they need to buy your product. And a marketing claim is any assertion that you make about your company or your brand or your product across all sorts of different channels. And it can show up in traditional marketing or advertising, digital promotions, public statements, and even on the products themselves on the packaging. So good claims satisfy consumer needs, business objectives, and cross-functional priorities. Also represented here, you'll see the 4 important corporate stakeholders that should have input before any new marketing claim goes public. So you have to have input from sales, product R&D, the brand managers and the people that work on the brand directly, and insight teams. It's all about turning a hypothesis into a real life marketing claim. And so you really want to think about these things, the inner circle, or sorry, the inner triangle, being really what the consumer is looking for in a claim, the different types of claims, the context claims, like, is this more seasonal? Is it, a claim that's around something like that has context, is about differentiating it from a different product, or is it a category driver that everything in the category does that? But I really like this representation that comes from the Clorox company that looked at things in this way to really understand better what a claim is and how you go about making it. In the end, a product offers as much value as the consumer actually perceives it does. So by comparing against objective benchmarks, a brand can portray a sense of superior performance that in mind of the consumer will unconsciously transfer its perceived value versus your competitors. So basically the consumer perception becomes reality. Now today, we have a really great group of people here. And we're going to be discussing from relaxing shampoos to calming supplements. Products aim to meet consumer needs with impressive ingredients and really strong statements that are in the marketing or on the product, whatever it might be. But these claims must adhere to regulatory standards, and they may be validated through preclinical or sometimes efficacy studies. With a rapidly evolving and growing wellness space in particular for consumer goods, everything from nutritional supplements, cannabinoids, and other plant-based phytocompounds and natural actives, how to really be sure that we're doing it right in a space like claims where it's already difficult to understand. So we've gathered a rather impressive group of professionals today to discuss this very issue. And so I'm going to join all of them to join us right now if they would like to come off mute so we can see their lovely faces. And I'll do some introductions. Martha did her undergraduate and master's thesis focused on the neurotransmission in model organisms, and her doctoral work was on the individual differences in human oral sensation. She's put a lot of work into evidence-based insights in CPG, ranging from fortified milk-based products all the way through carbonated beverages, beer and wine, tobacco, and even cannabis. Currently, as principal of her own consulting company of health and wellness, and she's also the consulting director of health and wellness with us at HCD Research. She lends her unique expertise and perspective to help researchers and leaders across CPG categories. Christine, who has joined us, has 20 plus years of sensory and consumer research experience across a variety of product categories, including baked goods, cereal, frozen foods, snack foods, and many others. She's currently director and sensory and consumer insights at Garza Consulting. She holds a bachelor's in consumer food science from Iowa State University and her master's in foods and nutrition from Kent State University. She's also active in SSP, or Society of Sensory Professionals, which we will be linking for anybody who's interested in learning more about SSP, where she serves as chair currently. Prior to being chair, Christine participated in SSP executive committees and has been member at large, planning. Now we also have Fathia, sensory scientist with over 30 years of R&D experience. She's currently principal consultant at her own consulting company. Her expertise includes sensory and consumer research for product development, claims substantiation, and quality assurance. She has a track record of creating and building sensory measurement capabilities and insights globally as sensory section head of Procter & Gamble. She earned her PhD in food chemistry from Cornell and bachelor's in chemistry at SUNY Binghamton. Now she's currently chair of ASTM International Sensory Evaluation Committee, the E18, and vice chair of the E1958, which is the standard guide for sensory claim substantiation task group. So we will have a link for that as well if you're interested in learning more, and Fathia will be letting us know a little bit more about what ASTM is as well. We are also joined by Dennis, who has spent over 15 years in the biotechnology industry, developing and deploying cell-based technology to enable discovery of novel compounds in flavor and fragrance, as well as in pharmaceuticals. Beyond discovery, Dennis developed and deployed novel natural flavors and ingredients, leading to multi-year collaborations with large consumer packaged goods companies. Currently principal at D3 Insight Consulting Company, Dennis enjoys applying his expertise of cell biology, natural product chemistry, sensory and consumer science, product development, sourcing, supply, and regulatory disciplines to novel opportunities in food, flavor, and biotech and biopharma. So without further ado, I would like to open this up for discussion with a few questions, both that we've had internally and in our talks with this panel, but also some questions that we received ahead of time from those of you that are attending. So let's start this off. Let's talk about what are claims. So how are claims different from other product research? Who would like to jump in on differentiating what a claim research even is?
So claims research is different than product development research in multiple ways. Claims research at its best is very focused, is specifically addressing supporting the claim, and it's not exploratory. So if you have exploratory work to do, I strongly recommend you do that before and get ready. And then plan very carefully, what are you going to claim? What's the best way to support that claim? And we'll be talking a lot about that. And focus on that and don't put anything extra in. That's all discoverable. You want to keep the study as focused as possible.
Yeah, I would echo that. Also is don't try to combine too many things. Like the claims work needs to be very much focused on that. There's a ton of other things you can be doing, but you don't want to muddy the waters when you get to a claims test.
Right.
That's a really good point. I think that a lot of times when we're all doing our more standard market and consumer research on products or whatever it might be, people like to cram in as much as they can, get their bang for their buck, right? So, we're not just asking about purchase intent. We also want to do the sensory profiling, or we also want to do focus groups, or we also want to do X, Y, and Z, just to try to utilize that time as much as possible. But what you're saying is that when you're doing claims research in particular, it can be very important that you don't have other things going on.
Exactly.
Now, is that something that is part of, some sort of regulation, or it's just best practices?
It's a best practice. It's one of the best practices in the ASTM guidelines for sensory claims substantiation. That it also impacts the statistics of the analysis if you start to go in too many directions as well. So keeping it focused, very clear. For example, if you're making a preference claim, just ask preference. I'm sure there's a lot of other things you want to learn. Do that separately. It can be part of the same recruit. You can get clever that way, but keep it a separate study.
Got it. Now, I think another part of this is you're talking about guidelines, right? So guidelines exist in the form of ASTM, which we have linked, and the ISO. Can you explain a little bit about what those organizations are?
Sure. So both ASTM and ISO are consensus committees. They're both international. ASTM is more North America focused and ISO is more European focused, but they both have global reach and their standards are both used globally. Both of those organizations have committees specifically addressing sensory evaluation. ISO works a little more country by country. It's a different approach. ASTM, anybody can join, and we strongly encourage you to join. And you can join in two ways. You can either join to get access to all the industry standard documents that are out there, or you can become more active and actually help us develop these standards and get involved in the discussions to develop these standards and vote on them as well. So these documents are, in my mind, beyond a peer-reviewed article. They're developed by a large group of people, lots of input, lots of discussion about what are the best practices, what's the best way to do things.
Interesting. And now these are guidelines, so they're not laws, right?
Right. That's very important. These are not legal documents. We've certainly consulted with and understood legal aspects, but especially when you're dealing globally, every country is going to have their legal aspects. For example, some countries don't allow competitive claims. So you need to know what's specific for where you're going to be making the claim.
Interesting. So how that seems like it's a very legal question. So in some cases, the larger organizations themselves might have a legal team or a regulatory team, but in some cases, the smaller companies, they may not have that expertise. So how can they navigate understanding sort of the rules of engagement when it comes to claims?
Right. So they can go out and solicit legal advice from sensory experts in the claims area. And another way to look at that in the United States is the NAD actually weighs in and challenges some claims, and they publish the results of those challenges so that you can search and look for NAD information on prior claims or claims challenges that can be relevant to what you're trying to do.
And maybe this is more directed to you, but I see a question in the Q&A that seems kind of related to the discussion that we're having about the sort of the rules of engagement here. It's good to limit things to just the claim you're trying to do, so you're not muddying the waters. Is there a limit for the claims questionnaire, like the number of questions that you can try to ask? Is there a rule around that?
There's not a hard and fast rule. The shorter, the better. We've had within our ad claims task group, we've had multiple discussions about, is there an exact number? And there isn't. It depends. Like a lot in sensory, it really depends. But keep it as focused as you can on the claim that you're making specifically. Don't make it a fishing expedition. People have gotten challenged and in trouble for trying to do a very broad range and picking out what works, and they sometimes get in trouble with that. So it's good to be careful.
That kind of sounds
also on
like
that, you don't want to have anything that contradicts another question.
Right.
So,
right.
I mean, it seems innocent enough, oh, I'll just include one more question. But if the results of one question could contradict or negate the claim you're trying to make, you just want to really be careful about what you include, because the NAD, especially if it's a competitive claim that goes into public everything, they will catch that and question it. So,
right. And maybe we'll get to this later, but the very first step is to think about, what do you want to claim? A later step down the line that you also want to think about before you start the research is, could this be challenged? How could this be challenged? How can I design my research up front to be ready for any? So for example, like Christine just talked about, making sure that there's not a potential conflict in there.
Interesting. Now there's different types of claims as well, right? So we're talking about sensory claims, and I know it's mainly because you guys are very sensory based, but there's also other types of claims, right? So there's, the taste or whatever it is that might be more sensory based, but when it comes to other things that might be the chemistry or the formulation or even consumer quantitative data just around liking one product more than another, or how they would describe a product. What are the options for substantiating claims across all the different types of things?
Go ahead.
I can jump in, but I'm sure everybody has thoughts too. I was frequently asked, oh, we need to do a claims test, but it was really something that was, you could prove in the formula. There was more of a specific ingredient, or more of, or, now less sugar or whatever. You could prove that through chemistry or other analytical measures. So that's actually probably the best way to do that type of claim substantiation, not even going to a consumer for those types of questions. And also sometimes when it's against yourself, like instead of a competitor, you need to kind of think about, what are those other ways that we could, is it now bigger? Is there, is it more in the box? Like some of those very literal claims can be compelling to consumers, but you don't necessarily have to test to say they acknowledge that and agree, if that makes sense. So you can go down the chemistry path, or you can go down the formulation proof, depending on your company structure. Companies I've been at, you could very easily lay out those formulas and prove that there was more of something in it or less of something, or nutritional facts panels, those types of things.
I guess I'd toss that a little bit over to Dennis. I see you nodding your head a little bit. I know you have a lot of the chemistry formulation background. When you are looking at ingredients that maybe have functional claims that can be made from them, maybe on their actual amounts, how do you go about those claims?
I think actually Christine's correct. The aspect of, say, sugar reduction, for instance, on the nutritional label, you can actually indicate you've got 30% less sugar. You have, some sort of flavors in there that are helping. Stevia, for instance, is a natural non-caloric sweetener. These sorts of things actually are very, I think, defined. And then you could actually, for instance, do magnetic profiling or have some sort of descriptive analysis indicating that you're at the same sweetness intensity as the original product, the full sugar product. When you get to, for instance, supplements, it's a very different beast, I think. And, if you're starting to make claims, it's one thing to claim this is a supplement. It's well known. It's been in the food chain before it's extracted. You have analytical chemistry. You could say, it's from an organic source. It is tested for residuals, pesticides, herbicides, etc. These sorts of things, aflatoxin, heavy metals, all these sorts of things you could say is a very clean label. But to go towards particular nutritional claims or functional claims, you start walking into the space of FDA. And it gets even more interesting if you have certain supplements. They may actually overlap. And the very classic case that I know of is red yeast rice. It's a naturally occurring product. It's a naturally occurring chemical that actually happens to be a statin that's marketed as a pharmaceutical. And this is probably from about 20 years ago. So at this point, you get into these interactions where if you're claiming functionality as it relates to health and human disease, you start walking a fine line towards FDA and drug regulation rather than something that's a supplement that's not typically regulated by FDA. The claim sets may be regulated by FTC. So you're doing the interplay of a lot of different government entities. And I think threading the needle, even if you think of foods, and I'll leave it at that, if you're claiming something that's well known in the scientific body of literature, so scientific agreement standard, significant scientific agreement standard, SSA, you can have an authorized health claim. So think of something like vitamin D for osteoporosis. You can't claim it can cure osteoporosis, but it can help prevent. You have also qualified health claims as well, where there may be some body of scientific literature, but it's not to full consensus. So those sorts of things are things that are considered. If you start walking beyond that, show that you have safety. That's going to be an important thing for FDA. Show that your claim set actually is, you can back it up. FTC will want to actually know about this as well. So
when do they start wanting that stuff? So if you decide to put it on your label, right, and you've done this research, whether it's some consumer research or maybe it's some machine-based formulation research, at what point do you have to show that data?
I think it depends on the strength of the claim that you're doing. And, for an example, if you're trying to claim something has health benefits, ultimately, you're looking at something that's probably a clinical study, especially if it's in the drug space. And in certain of these areas, I think it's a later part of this discussion. And again, it's not an area I've ever worked in, but it's out of interest. There are certain things that are recommended based on clinical studies, but it's not still been FDA reviewed yet. And so I think the body of knowledge that's out there, if you're talking about health and human claims, it's really safety. And it is also efficacy at that point. Is it doing what it's actually doing, stated to do? So I think those two arms are something that are very important. And I think going back to what was mentioned before, understanding what you're trying to claim and how far you are trying to claim it, that's actually going to frame out the sensory testing or whatever other additional testing that's going to support those claims.
Interesting. Now, I think you've brought up supplements, and I think that this is important to bring up because it almost is considered a little bit of the Wild West to some degree, whether we're talking about supplements or we're talking about, cannabis products. And also, even to some degree, I think essential oils, right? So I think in a lot of these cases where you might have natural ingredients that are technically active, and that a lot of the it's more like perceived claim in a way where if you were to just slap the CBD label on it or slap the added protein label on it. They don't have to say for heart health, right? But it is implied. How do you navigate those sort of issues where you have an active that there is definitely research that has physiological impacts, but it's not really a claim per se if you just slap that you have essential oils on it?
I think going back to this aspect of red yeast rice, what the FDA did, and that's precedent. If you're concentrating, if you're actually trying to do something that becomes extremely concentrated for a particular active, that's no longer a kind of light extract like you're making a tea or an infusion from something. You're really focused on enriching a particular bioactive ingredient. At that point, that moves it into space that may be of more concern to FDA. So for instance, you mentioned CBD, and again, that's not space that I've worked in the past or currently, but that's something where people are focusing in with particular ways to extract, where you're concentrating particular subsets. That may be of interest to FDA in terms of safety, because they've done clinical studies actually and have clinically approved products for specific syndromes that elicit seizures, where there was observation of liver toxicity, there was observation of potentially some reproductive or fertility issues. Interestingly, even in canine CBD studies for osteoarthritis, there were some liver side effects that were observed, I believe, as well. So don't quote me on that, but I think it was the case as well. Compare that to something that I think would be called broad spectrum or full spectrum. That's more of an extract from hemp. And as long as you're keeping this below the level of 0.3% delta 9, that's something that actually it could potentially, and there was talk of that last year with FDA that I had seen in public literature, that they may consider that differently. And that might potentially be an NDI, a new dietary ingredient, rather than actually a full bore therapeutic drug. So again, it depends on how the product is being made, and then moving that is there. I'm seeing a question coming in too, fines and fees. And actually to add on to this, there've probably been about 40 or 50 warning letters based on claims for specific CBD products that have gone out to companies that are not substantiated, and they're warning that's actually drug claims.
Interesting. Now, I wonder if it ends up being a drug claim, even if it's not CBD, or maybe it is something a little more like an essential oil, right, that's added to a shampoo. But they have labeled the shampoo as being relaxing, which is a psychoactive effect, right? So what happens there in that situation where, you might have done some consumer research where people have reported feeling more relaxed, and they are associating that with the essential oil that's added to the personal care product. How does that work with like a new drug situation?
I think again, it's going to be depending on how the claim is set up, and as an analogy, I mean, if it's in cosmetic products as an aroma, scent, if it's really for cleansing and for beautifying, making yourself smell better, that's typically in the cosmetics, so the BFD and C rather than FDA space. If you start making true claims, like for instance, this can, for aromatherapy, it's going to help with, tension headaches, migraine headaches, etc. Again, that's changing function of the body. So you're navigating that fine space. I think it's how the claim is framed out. And like an example I was thinking of, and this is just a little bit of a ridiculous example, considering everyone's wearing, or a lot of people are wearing masks right now, people, some of them don't like it because it gets hot and stuffy. What happens if you had it where it was impregnated with a mint or menthol type aroma for cooling, for breathing, for relaxation while you're wearing the masks? Depending on how you set up that question, it may be just something that people can wear the mask longer. It's something that's nice. You're not making a claim specifically about that. If you suddenly start actually looking at anxiety levels, this gets, I think, more into, your space and Martha's space in terms of the neuro aspect as well. That's something that actually could be a claim that then is taking down anxiety. So I think it's how it goes back exactly to what Tia and Christine said. How do you frame the claim questions even in these spaces as well?
So perhaps some caution needs to be taken in just even how you're asking that question in the survey, let's say.
Yes.
You want to be sure that the question you ask in the survey is essentially the same as the claim whenever possible.
And that gets back to definitions, right? Where there are clear definitions when you're talking about formulation. So when you say reduction in sugar, you know you're exactly looking for the amount of compound in the formulation. But when it comes to relaxation of a lotion, right, that do people report that it's a relaxing fragrance? What does relaxing mean? So I wonder if anybody can speak to that a little bit, even, you know, in the words that are more standard in sensory, like intensity, right? So what do these types of words mean? How do you navigate that sort of issue?
Oh, sorry, I'll jump in here a little bit and just, it comes back always to the way that you frame the claim. If you're saying it will make you relax X amount more, then you think of it more as an actual functional physiological claim of it's having this impact on your physiology, chemistry, everything else. If it's it'll make you feel more relaxed, then I think that's something more that we can play with within the ASTM framework for, you know, liking, feeling overall better, feeling. You can quantify those with surveys, but if you're trying to get into an actual functional, you know, or gives you energy, that's another one. Keeps you, helps you stay awake longer. Well, does it, or does it just feel like that? You know, or is it a placebo? That's a whole different question.
That kind of gets to one of the slides that I had, that consumer perception becomes reality,
Yes.
right? So if they feel that it's a relaxing fragrance, they're going to feel more relaxed, like that's their reality. And I guess that's kind of what I'm asking about with these sort of, you know, psychological claims, like how does that differentiate? Which is tough to navigate. So getting to some of the questions that we have here, we do have a question about sort of the makeup of the people that you ask. So when it comes to consumer segmentation, so for example, if you claim a product is now more whatever, something not formula related, but only half of the population can detect that sense, let's say, or it's only applicable to a certain type of population, like a skin type or something, or hair type, let's say, how would you approach setting up a study like this?
So you absolutely have to put together a rationale for how you're going to do it. So once you have your specific claim, then who does it make sense to test among? Is it current product users? Is it potential users? You have to think through all of those things and be specific about what you're doing and have a rationale for it, so that if you're challenged, you can say, this claim was in the whole context of getting new people to try this product. And so we focused our testing on new people trying the product for the first time, something like that.
So that kind of getting at what is a normal demographic? So when you're talking about general population, for like a general study for a CPG, you know, study, what are the sample requirements for Gen Pop?
So if you're doing a very broadly used product, then you want to get into demographics for the area that you're making the claim in. So it could be a countrywide claim, or it could be that you're just claiming on the West Coast and you would only test on the West Coast. But the ad claims document gets into that very specifically. And so, for example, you might look at market share, or you might look at geographic distribution. You may look at age, you may look at gender. It's all dependent on how exactly you word the claim. So one of the classic ones that we even mentioned is the Choosy Mothers Choose Jif. That testing was done with the mothers choosing the peanut butter for their children, and it was specifically among those people that actually expressed a choice versus people that said, oh, these are both fine.
That's a really good way of putting it. So when it comes to sensory related claims, there's a lot of different tools you can use, right? So we've been talking a little bit about survey tools. What are the tools that are recommended currently for, the descriptive, discrimination? It seems like that, again, might be driven on the type of claim that you're trying to make, but there's a lot of options out there, right?
Absolutely. And there's discussion about, I keep going back to the guidelines, but they're wonderful to look through. I just want to make a quick comment that I especially like section 9. It's about documentation, but it's also about what are all the things I need to think through to get ready to do my study, my claim substantiation study.
Absolutely. Now, there's a question here about OTC. So OTC products, maybe this goes to Dennis and Martha a little bit, but they have a drug fact box, right? So when it comes to the drug fact box, there are claims that don't need to be asked, right? Because it's under monograph. So if you have something like actives that are specific for acne or some sort of dermatological issue there, what's the situation that you've seen in cases like that?
Martha, do you want to answer that one?
Sorry, is that when a
Like an
product
active
is
box on it, specifically when you think about OTC products, maybe they tell you what the active ingredients are. So it has and then you have additional information about it. It's got so over much amount of acetaminophen in it. So you don't need to, because it's under monograph, you don't have to do claims research on that. Is that correct?
I believe that's correct.
Yeah.
I qualify my comments that I believe that's correct. And these things are, again, country specific, as we were saying earlier. So Canada, US, very similar, but still there are some differences. If you are making a claim of pain relief, some sort of removal of a state, you still have to have claims research, whether that, I think it depends on the drug and the status of the drug and how, right? Like, you still have to have the evidence package. I'm just shooting it to Dennis. I'm not sure who that goes to.
I think that, with OTC at that point, at least for pharmaceutical, so example, say you have a generic antihistamine, a generic Zyrtec or something like that. The typical claims that you'll see on label for generic, over the counter, compared to the active ingredient in Zyrtec, and so it's a parity claim basically that they're there, but you have that where you've got actually the same active ingredient, formulated generically. So that's the same API that's actually in there at the same concentration. So that gets back to an analytical chemistry claim that actually is defined for the, drugstore brand of that particular thing. So I don't think when it actually ties to what it's already known from what an active pharmaceutical is doing, that it's been demonstrated, there's a product monograph, it's already been through the clinical trials. That's something that for me at least, and again, that is not my specific area of expertise, a little bit downstream, but that's what I believe as well, Martha.
So we've talked about legal expertise getting involved. It's also really, really helpful to get regulatory expertise involved.
Absolutely.
And these questions would be better addressed by somebody with regulatory expertise for where you want to make the claim.
Yes.
Yep. Which is also very important. But I think one thing that somebody pointed out, and I've definitely experienced in my own background as well, is that regulatory can vary by company, right? So perhaps a company that has maybe received letters from the FDA in the past, or companies that are, say, newer, or companies that deal in products that don't tend to be under the limelight for lots of claim issues. There can be some differences in regulatory. Can you comment on that a little bit for those of you that have maybe worked with different companies or something of that sort?
So it's a risk assessment. It's absolutely a risk assessment, and company culture is going to weigh into that. And you have to be aware of what could possibly happen. And even if you haven't gotten regulatory scrutiny in the past, if you make a claim that catches attention, you may get some attention that you've never ever had before. So being ready for that is very important.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think to that point too, you have to sort of think of everyone that's reading your claim, right? It's not just regulators or government or, you know, your competition. It's your consumers.
Yes.
So your consumers, if you look at Truth in Advertising, their website has a cajillion examples of where the advertising doesn't mesh up with what the product is. I was just looking at them earlier, and there's some that, you know, you would think are hilarious kind of, but at the same time, if the dandruff shampoo is causing my dandruff, how can you claim that it's ameliorating my dandruff? Like, it's these sorts of claims that, yeah, when you go back and look, it's how did they even think they could do that? And a lot of it's consumers and consumer advocacy groups. You know, like you look at kids foods, toddler foods, it's mom groups that bring these, you know, like I notice this difference in my kids' formula or in my kids' not energy drink, but nutritional drink. They talk amongst themselves, and before you know it, you've got a class action lawsuit, right? So where these kinds of pushes are coming from, I think you need to have all hands on deck to imagine that when you're building claims, because it can come from anywhere. Yeah, if you're not meshing up your claim with what you're delivering, you should expect a challenge somewhere, even if it's just to your consumer helpline, right? Like you said, this would work better than before, and it doesn't. So what do you say to consumers, to your customers, sort of across the board?
I think that's a really good discussion to have around the challenges that can happen, right? So where do challenges come from? The fact that you've seen it coming a lot of times from consumers, right? But certainly it can come from competitors if you're making competitive claims. What are some other typical stumbling blocks that happen in claims testing that you've seen or even maybe experienced?
Well,
so
go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, just going back to recruiting the right people, you know, you have data, but maybe you only tested with a very small group of people and didn't cover all the people that you were claiming for. That can be, and then when you share your data, it's clear that you tested, wild case, let's say 25 people in one city, and it's a national claim, that's going to get shot down immediately.
Who's going to shoot that down, out of curiosity?
Well, the NED, for example, in the United States.
Yeah, I think that's good for people to understand, like who's looking at these things, right?
But it could go to court too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and I think it's fair to
too. So
yeah, I think it's fair to remember that anybody can suggest your claim to a group, right? Like if there's a claim I'm especially frustrated about as a customer, or that just I don't think it can be true, I can take that and go to the NED and say, hey, maybe you guys should look at this, or to whatever advocacy group. So it can come from anywhere. And I think just to touch back on something, I think either Christine or Basiah said, discoverable. Like you don't want to try to make a claim that's very different from what your product is delivering, or that your product doesn't live up to, because anything you do or have done around that product and around developing that claim, if you do end up going to court, that's all going with you. So reminding everyone on the, you know, everybody who's on the bus for making the claim that these things have to be considered as discoverable, and you work under that sort of halo, that it makes things go better. And sometimes, you know, our marketing friends can sort of think outside of that very restrictive bubble that we have for claims, which that's the point. But often you find, like in my experience doing claims, it's been pulling people back in and, okay, that's wild. We would love if it could do that. Now, what can it really do? And that's where we start. Don't start with the big wide open, start with the narrow, and okay, if we can do this, good. And I think, Michelle, we've talked about a million times, pilot studies, do a small study first. make sure you're doing what you say you're doing or what you think you're doing before spending who knows how much, infinite money.
I think to build on that a little bit, when you're doing the pilot study, you can also find the best way to ask something, because you might find that the way you were trying to ask it isn't the way it needed to be asked. I see a comment question here in the chat that's kind of talking to that a little bit about, okay, so if you're talking about perceived effects like calming and relaxing that might go with botanicals or even dietary supplements, whether it's relaxing tea or a relaxing supplement, or if it's a CBD product, what's the difference in asking if something relaxes you or saying that it helps you relax or that it promotes relaxation or that it helps promote calm? Because, I think for the general consumer, they might see that relaxation and calm are in the same wheelhouse. But when we think about the definitions of it or what's legal to use, there may be some nuances in this type of wording of, it literally relaxes you or it promotes relaxation as being differences. So when it comes to using a verb or a description or anything like that, what's more likely to be flagged by the FDA or FTC? I think we've stumped them.
I think going back to what Dia said, that's really a regulatory and law question, because that type of wording is very, very nuanced. And
yeah,
again, like I said, with SSA, the scientific standard, significant scientific agreement standard for health claims, authorized health claims versus qualified health claims, you're going from something that you really can claim that, like vitamin D is helpful in preventing osteoporosis, versus scientific data suggests but is not proven to. So even there, it's like there are nuanced levels, and I think the wording is a tightrope sometimes. I think that's actually rather important to say. I think going back also, I think it was with you mentioned the different jurisdictions and different geographies. If you have a multinational company, you may need harmonization between what your claim set is. Again, going back to, if you're claiming something in one country, could that be, if it's the same formulation, if it's the same active ingredient concentrations, are you claiming something that then could be pulled in a different jurisdiction for more interesting discussions and not necessarily fun discussions?
Yeah. That doesn't
I
sound
would say
fun
the
at all.
one thing to add to the wording question is, if you have 3 or 4, or I've seen people with, hey, there's 10 ways to say this, right? Write them all down, think of them through with your core team, and then probably go to regulatory or legal or some combination, because there could be something like, I can't recall the specifics of it, but we had something that was worded 3 or 4 ways and legal crossed one off instantly. Like you can't prove that.
Absolutely.
It was
We've
a
done
food
that a
product
little
and
bit.
it was a health claim or something, it was like something we couldn't prove in the type of testing we were considering. So don't eliminate them before you at least have the conversation, but you also probably really need to think through, like, can I honestly feel good about saying this, and will this product deliver? Like, I think there is a, as a researcher and as a developer, kind of that question to ask. But
yeah, we've certainly had to have that hard conversation with clients that have come to us to do claims research, where they have a list of claims they want to make, and we're proposing the different ways to measure those things. And we've had to say, we don't think that this is a good question, right? Which is hard to say, but it's always, I think it's good in a research partner that at least one person can say no, right?
So in addition, that making the list, like Christine talked about, is really, really helpful, not only to make sure that you're not crossing a line somewhere, but also maybe figuring out which wording is the most impactful with the group that you're trying to reach. So it's that balance between what can we say legally, regulatory, what can we say that resonates with the people that we're trying to market to.
Now, when it comes,
what question can we ask? Right? Like, if you want a certain claim, but there's no way you can ask a consumer that question, or, the response would be very bizarre somehow. What are you doing, right? If you can't ask the question or you can't use the language, then it's a non-starter.
Right. Absolutely.
Which is hard discussion to have too, when people are really, the claim is their baby and you have to tell it it's ugly. It's It's not good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And when it comes to, again, I guess it's kind of around definitions of what ends up being a good claim that you can confidently make, there are nuances to even how you ask the question. So, of course, there's a definition of, is it promoting or is it causing, or any of those types of nuances. But also, if it's a scale question, is it 5-point? Is it 9-point? What's the percent cutoff that qualifies it? Like, what's the statistical significance that has to happen there? What's the qualifier, basically? Because if I ask something in 5-point and it would have differentiated differently in 9-point, what's the recommendation there?
So again, that goes into your rationale when you're setting up the study. What's your action standard? What's your decision criteria? If I get these results, then that supports the claim. If I have these statistical parameters met, then I've supported my claim. So you want to plan that and state that up front, and even have your analysis plan back to the focus, not only the questionnaire, the study design, the study execution, also the analysis plan, all really thought through, and the consequences of that thought through before you run the study.
Kind of alongside of that, when thinking about the group of people that you're asking these questions to, the subject pool, do different types of claims, when you're talking about general pop or maybe a specific population, clients always want to do the minimum, right? Because of cost and time, especially when thinking about superiority claims, that if one product is better than another. So how do you adjust for that? How do you answer that question?
Then you bring in statistical expertise and do power calculations and really figure out what are the key demographics I'm going to design against. You may have all these different age, region, all those sorts of things. What are my key ones that I'm going to design the study against? And then set up your analysis plan to make sure that you have a clear significance. So for example, in the ASTM guidelines, we talk about 95% confidence a lot for our statistical analyses as being a good standard to make sure that you've met.
Absolutely. Now I have another question, and this one's maybe throwing it to Martha and potentially Dennis, or really anybody who has a thought on this. How can you decide if something is clinical or market research?
Yeah, that's a great question. Maybe, you know what? I'm going to let Dennis start, and then I'll add on.
She's throwing you in front of the bus.
Yeah, he's more the drug discovery person than I am by far. So
No, I think, and I'm conservative. I tend to say, if you're talking about something and it's touching on FDA and you're looking at an activity that's going to be affecting biological processes in the body, you could do it as a marketing, setup at that point, but you may have FDA knocking on your door. And again, going back to the example in the CBD space, there's been a lot of worded letters from FDA in the last few years towards that. And so I think setting this up, but it's not trivial. And I mean, even using CBD, and again, not my space that I've worked in ever, but knowing that there's potential of fertility. If you start talking about, DART studies, developmental and reproductive toxicology studies as part of this, that's not something to trifle with. And I think at least for that particular industry, this arm of going to full spectrum or broad spectrum extractives, that's an interesting discussion. The other possibility is, for any of the groups or associations, the national associations, is that something that people should be pooling together, some money to actually establish that for safety, because that would actually be a big breather. And I know there are discussions with these groups with FDA, but I think whenever you start talking in what is pharmaceutical related space, it goes back to the question that's there. And I can say that even from the flavors discovery that I did. Always very fun to be upstream and be kind of the, silly scientist finding new things, on the lab bench. But if you can't source it, if you can't actually produce it, it's not going to be at a proper cost and use. And it's not going to be regulatory approved, or it's going to be very painful to get it regulatory approved. That's a question of risk versus reward. And so asking the back end questions, if you're doing this as marketing research claim, but you're in a position that you could get hammered by a regulatory agency, depending on whichever geography you're in, you've just wasted that research framing the questions out the way you did. So I think, again, it's almost, a broken record, but it goes back to what Patia said. Taking the time to actually have regulatory expert input and legal, whatever it is the case, food law or whatever it is, that helps frame the discussion. I think, like with what Christine said, having an understanding of what those claim sets potentially could be helps streamline that discussion with those particular experts, which in the end, the billable hours are a little bit lower as well. So it's worth doing that with the internal team and then rippling that out to people that are experts. And it's very tough because, we've talked about, cosmetic space, homeopathic / aromatherapy space, foods, beverages, drugs, medications, nutritional supplements. All of these will have people in their different wheelhouse, and you need those folks focused in those particular areas.
And I think it's important to think about in that, when we're making these claims, maybe if they're coming from, like you're saying, the silly scientists coming up with these different ideas, it's also important to think about, if you're going to be investing all this money, how do we know what claims are important to make? And there's another side to claims studies, which aren't just, substantiating the claims, but also looking at which claims are going to be most effective. Like, do they even matter to the consumer? So is it important to even say that it's causing relaxation if the consumer doesn't care? Because I think getting back to that idea of that consumer perception becomes reality, right? It sounds like we've all had a little bit of experience there as well.
Yeah, you definitely want to do some pre-work to find those claims. And at that stage, they may not have to be correctly worded per se, as much as you want to know what space of those claims might be most motivating or most beneficial. There's a lot of ways to do it, but yeah, you want to do some homework and some pre-work before you ever get down to a claim study of whatever kind. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in the clinical versus sort of marketing or consumer, a lot of things are the Wild West, right? And that's just because regulators haven't gotten to them yet or haven't figured out the best way to regulate them. So just because there isn't regulation today doesn't mean there won't be tomorrow. So if you're just blindly making claims, that might be okay for a little while, but it's going to come back and bite you later, most likely. So if you're thinking clinical versus consumer, I mean, especially in the cannabis space and sort of the, bleeding edge potential pharmaceuticals, psilocybin, mushrooms, different drugs for mental health, you have to think, is this something that people would normally have access to? Because they are still compounds that result in physiological effects and changes. So if it's something that a month ago I would have had to do in a clinical setting with healthcare professionals, with monitoring, with urine screening, with whatever else happening, I'm not just going to throw that out to a really simple, well, it's not really simple, a less costly and complicated consumer study than clinical study just because of the cost savings. I would still push for more of a clinical style there.
And with that, I think we've kind of come up on the hour, and there's so much discussion to have here that I do want to encourage everybody, if you have questions that you would like to ask more directly to any of the panelists here, feel free to reach out to them on LinkedIn. I have their names up here. And I believe we're going to try to continue this conversation. We have some vidcasts that we do, and I think it would be good to maybe do some individual recordings with the panelists if they're interested, that we can also share. With that, feel free to take a look at our HCD YouTube page, where you can find some more of this information, where we will be posting some conversations that we hope to continue this conversation with these panelists. So please feel free to find that and subscribe. And any future conversations that we have, we hope that you can join us. If you have questions and you're not able to reach out to any of the panelists here, please feel free to contact us individually, and we'll be happy to relay any of those questions or to answer them as best as we can. We'd love to have you join us in the future for future conversations that we're going to have, these panelist discussions. We found to be very valuable. So I hope that you can join us. I believe we're going to be talking about AI in our next one, because who doesn't talk about AI? Everybody talks about it, but nobody necessarily understands what that means. So join us for these conversations. Our hope is that we can all learn more together. So feel free to tweet with us, reach out to us, read some of the things that we put, and of course, feel free to reach out to any of the panelists that you see here. Again, I'm going to put their names up here in case you do want to reach out on LinkedIn. So thanks for joining us today, and I hope everybody has a great rest of your day. Special thanks to the panelists that joined us for sharing your expertise.